We regret exceedingly to have confirmed that Mr. White has been placed in a private madhouse in London. His madness, if madness it were, consisted in an assumed liberty of conversation to great and small. We think the best thing that could be done for Mr. White would be to send him out here again, where he would be amongst his old friends. Today, we travel from convict hell to an asylum in London, with a stop at a pub along the way, as we meet up again with our old friend Dicky White. Welcome to Rat Bags and Roustabouts, a place where we tell those extraordinary stories of ordinary people who never made it to the history books. I'm your host, Marion Langford. Before we start today's story, I just wanted to thank everyone out there listening for the wonderful support I've had with the start of Rat Bags and Roustabouts. As I get into the second part of Dicky White's life here, here's a shout out to all of the ancestors of Dicky who have contacted me and listened to part 1. Hopefully you all enjoy part 2. I do my best with the research for these stories, but obviously all I have is old records and newspaper reports to go by. And they don't always paint a complete picture, but we do our best. Also, if you've been enjoying these stories, you can head to the website, ratbagsandroustabouts.com, for all the show notes for each episode, which, among other things, lists and gives some of the resources that I've used for my research. And I'm also going to be adding some little extra interesting snippets there. They're things that I might have come across while researching that didn't quite make it to the final script. And if you have your own awesome family history story to tell, there's a contact form on the website that you can fill in. I'm hoping that in time I'll be able to start researching and writing episodes based on some of your stories as well. Anyway, let's get started. In our last episode, we heard about Dicky White's early life. In Tasmania, he's best known as being one of the first Launceston publicans, but in reality, he was so much more. Last time we followed him as he travelled from revolutionary America to London, where we found him committing highway robbery, stealing a watch from a clerk called George Chiletto, and being sentenced to death. Then, of course, the mother of his baby died, his sentence was commuted to life transportation, and he and son John set off on the Hillsborough convict ship, where they barely survived horrendous weather, a cruel, paranoid captain, and a typhus epidemic. So let's now head to Port Jackson, 1799, and meet up with him again as he and John finally disembark the ship and Dicky begins his new life as a convict in New South Wales. Now, obviously, these days, Sydney is known for the Opera House, Harbour Bridge, expensive real estate and no parking spots. But just to give you an idea of what Sydney was like in those days, let's hear from our old mate, William Noah. If you remember from the last episode, Noah was a convict who was also on the Hillsborough ship alongside Dicky, and he kept a detailed diary from that voyage. Once he arrived at Port Jackson, he shared a few observations of the settlement. He said there were about 1,000 or 1,400 houses in the town. The inhabitants weren't allowed after 9 p.m. If you were, you needed a password which changed daily. And if you didn't know the password, you would end up in prison. He also said there were about 40 constables made up out of the free people, and on a Sunday they would go house to house to check that everyone was at church. If you were found bunking off, it was 50 lashes. Wheat was as good to use for currency as actual coins. Convicts were put into gangs dependent on the work they were doing with an overseer to make sure they did what they were told. Hunger was a problem for everyone. In his diary, Noah wrote this: "The convicts work from 5 a.m. till 3. Our food allowance is not enough to serve 3 days. After toiling 8 or 10 years, you are the same as when you began. As for shoes, I have seen none since my arrival here, but what cost a guinea a pair." He also said despite the vast size of the island and the distance they were from England, many convicts still thought they could escape and couldn't be convinced otherwise. In Noah's words, "The extent of this country is laid down by several geographers, where they make it certain of being an island of the length of 4,000 miles, but it is not the opinion of the common people, and so obstinate they are of its joining India, that several have been lost in trying to find it out." But after about 2 years, Dicky and we assume John ended up on Norfolk Island. We have Dicky show up on a muster there in 1801. Norfolk Island is a small South Pacific island around 1,600 kilometres from Sydney, and the British set up a convict settlement there almost as soon as they'd taken up residence at Port Jackson. There were a few reasons for this. It was political, to stop the French getting the island. It was for resources. The island had a plentiful supply of Norfolk pines and flax, and after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain needed timber to build ships, and the flax could make material for sails. And it was also intended that the Norfolk Island settlement would supply food to Port Jackson. Of course, a South Pacific island sounds idyllic, yes? In fact, another prisoner, a bloke called John Grant, wrote a diary of his time as a convict, and in it he described his own amazement at his first seeing the island. It is only about 20 miles in circumference, and superb trees called pines grow in all parts to a vast height, and a mountain rises on one side, forming a spectacle of the greatest beauty when approached from the sea. But Norfolk Island was anything but paradise. Really, you'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere on earth you'd less like to be at that time. Joseph Foveaux had just become Lieutenant-Governor of the island, and one of his first acts in charge was to hang 2 men without trial for allegedly leading a plot to overthrow the settlement. And honestly, when you look at Foveaux's rap sheet, that was one of the least bad things that he did. I think we can pretty safely call Foveaux a tyrant. The chief jailer, Robert Bucky Jones, summed Foveaux up by saying he believed more in the lash than the Bible. He also routinely sold off the female convicts. Bucky wrote, "His treatment of women convicts was the most brutal. They were looked upon as slaves and sold openly to the free settlers and convicts alike." Foveaux himself had essentially stolen the wife of one of his sergeants as soon as he arrived on the island, and the couple could do little more than accept it. Bucky said young, good-looking girls would fetch as much as £10 at these horrendous auctions. Foveaux was also said to take a deep personal pleasure in watching punishments of the prisoners, and the smallest complaint or digression would see you strapped on the triangle and given 25 lashes, with a bucket of salt water thrown across your back afterwards for good measure. And as soon as you'd received your punishment, you would be sent back to work. Bucky said, "The women were similarly treated, only that their bodies were exposed to the male convicts, they being compelled to walk naked before them. It was usual for the men to be placed in a circle around the flogger and his victim with the commandant as eye-witness. Major Foveaux had a passion for witnessing punishments of that description. He would often order some poor unfortunate wretch to the triangle and laugh at his cries for mercy." Another favourite punishment was to tighten a convict's leg irons by increments every month so that eventually they dug into the flesh. Or there was the water pit, which was a kind of prison cell that was filled with 1/2 metre of salt water. The prisoner was stripped and placed in it for days. If they fell asleep in there, they would drown. Bucky described the situation on the island under Foveaux as being beyond human imagination. In fact, when John Grant was on Norfolk Island, it was after Foveaux's time, but in that description of the island that he wrote, he also talked about the effect Foveaux had had on the settlement. "The military treat the inhabitants harshly. Slavery prevails. Dissolute people do as they wish. The rascally Major Foveaux has left behind sad traces of his tyranny. The blood of many cries out for vengeance. May he atone for it upon the scaffold." We don't know if Dicky felt the wrath of Foveaux. Was he ever placed on the triangle? Had his leg irons tightened, put in the water pit? It certainly sounds like punishment of some kind was unavoidable. When it comes to taking a wife, though, there we finally have some solid information, because it was on Norfolk Island, the hardest place on earth, that Dicky's heart melted. He met a woman called Sarah. Sarah Clayton had been living her life in a small town in Yorkshire with her husband William and their son Henry. But it was all turned upside down when William was arrested for stealing sheepskins. He was sentenced to 7 years transportation. Without William, Sarah and Henry would be left destitute, but they managed to get passage on the same transport and so came out with William, arriving in New South Wales in 1802 and then being sent on to Norfolk Island. Henry was around the same age as Dicky's son John. We don't know how they all met. There's a story that Sarah was looking after John for Dicky, but clearly somehow Dicky and Sarah were thrown together, and together they would be for the rest of their lives. With records from this first settlement of Norfolk Island fairly sparse, it's hard to say for sure whether Sarah and Dicky lived together on the island, though we know they certainly did later when they were in Van Diemen's Land. But right now, let's leave them falling in love while we pay a quick visit to the theatre. Yes, there may have been floggings galore, escape may have been impossible, women may have been treated as a commodity, but even those Norfolk Islanders needed some entertainment. And this is where we see Dicky's true character start to emerge. He joined the theatre. Incidentally, another player in the theatre was William Redfern, whose name you might recognise. He would later become a prominent doctor in New South Wales, and the Sydney suburb of Redfern is named after him. Anyway, Dicky took part in the theatre, and I also believe it may have been on Norfolk Island where he learnt to play the fiddle. Now, I quoted a couple of passages from John Grant's account of his time as a convict. He was a pretty interesting guy. So interesting I may even devote an entire episode on him at some point. He originally was transported for shooting a lawyer in the bum. I mean, forget stealing food for your family. What a reason to be sentenced for transportation. He shot this lawyer because the lawyer was trying to stop him from courting one of his client's daughters, who John Grant was desperately, hopelessly in love with. So he gets sent to New South Wales, gets to Sydney, and then he writes something negative about the governor of the time, Philip Gidley King. That was enough to see him found guilty of libel and sent on to Norfolk Island. Grant wasn't really your typical convict. He'd been working as a clerk in England, but was a bit of a creative type. He wrote poetry, he played the harpsichord and the violin. He'd brought a fiddle with him when he made the journey out from England. So, is it just possible that it was Grant who taught Vicky how to play? Look, I might be adding 2 and 2 and getting 5 here, but even if that wasn't what happened, we can at least imagine the two of them playing a duet under the Norfolk pines. Of course, as I said, Grant wasn't there until after Foveaux had left as governor. He left because of ill health in 1804, and the next guy in charge, John Piper, was a world away from his predecessor's sadistic bloodlust. He was a lot more measured in his treatment of the convicts. Probably the most interesting thing about Piper was that he started a relationship with the 14-year-old daughter of one of the convicts, Mary Ann Shears, something which would obviously be illegal these days. The pair eventually married, but not until Mary Ann was 26 years old, and by then she'd had 11 children with Piper. Meanwhile, there were rumblings coming from Port Jackson. The powers that be wanted to shut the island settlement down. There was a lot of correspondence back and forth as Piper talked up what the settlement had to offer. Those in charge back in Port Jackson said it wasn't paying its way, and so on. When that argument failed, Piper started going on about the problems with how to actually get people off the island. Essentially, this back and forth took years before anything was actually agreed on. In the meantime, we have the Rum Rebellion going on back in Sydney. That was in 1808, when the then Governor William Bligh, who essentially everyone hated, was overthrown by a group of prominent officers and landowners. They included John MacArthur, who incidentally was good friends with Piper. But really, I think Piper was best out of it over on Norfolk Island. Bligh was shipped off to Hobart, and the group ran Port Jackson settlement until Lachlan Macquarie arrived from England in 1810. In the meantime, back on Norfolk Island, people were gradually being moved to Van Diemen's Land until finally, in around 1810, we've only got 117 people left on the island, and they're told, this is it, the settlement has to shut down. This wasn't to everyone's liking. Many of the residents had built lives for themselves on Norfolk. They also knew how hard it was starting from scratch in a fledgling settlement, and they weren't keen to have to do it again. As a sweetener, they were promised generous land grants in the area around Launceston in Van Diemen's Land, an area which was named Norfolk Plains as a nod to its inhabitants. 2 ships carried the remaining residents to their new life, and I think it's pretty telling of the strained relationship between Sarah and her husband that she, Henry and John all travelled on the Minstrel, while William boarded the other ship, the Lady Nelson. Our old mate Dicky was on neither of these, though. He had been chosen by William Hutchinson, who'd been a convict with him on the Hillsborough but was now an overseer, to be part of the group to stay behind and dismantle and destroy the settlement. They killed stock, they demolished and burned buildings. They needed to make the place uninhabitable to stop anyone else from sailing by and taking ownership. But finally, in February 1814, Dicky boarded the Kangaroo and joined Sarah and the boys in Launceston. He had a conditional pardon. This became an absolute pardon later that year, and he was in a place brimming with opportunity. This is where we finally see Dicky being himself in all his wonderful fun and eccentric ways. His whole life, even on Norfolk Island, he had worked in subservient roles. Now for the first time he could be his own boss, in control of his own future. First of all, he and a mate, Whittle, decided on a plot of land each in the centre of Launceston. At that time, free settlers could mark out a piece of land and live on it while they got the proper legal documents. So they pegged their claims out and squatted there until a title could be procured. Dicky built a pub, the Launceston Hotel, while Whittle built himself a wattle and daub home across the street. It seems Dicky chose his land well, as the Launceston Hotel ended up being slap bang in the centre of the city, on the corner of Brisbane and St John Streets. In fact, for a long time, Brisbane Street was apparently known as Dick White Street. Dicky soon fell into his new life as a respectable businessman. It was a far cry from his short and dubious career as a highwayman. And it was quite a fortuitous choice of career for Dicky, as it seemed those Vandemonians loved a drink. In fact, by 1848, it was estimated there was a pub for every 166 inhabitants. By 1871, that was one for every 30. So when Dicky built his hotel and got his liquor licence, it was pretty much an overnight success. There's a lovely memory that was published in the Examiner newspaper talking about the Launceston Hotel. There is not another allotment or section of land in the town which possesses such a history as this one. The occupant of the land, Richard White, was a native of Norfolk Island. In the year 1822, he received a licence of occupancy for 1,000 years for the land upon which the present Launceston Hotel stands and surrounding premises. I know of only one other such licence being given. The Launceston Hotel early became a popular house owing to the good management of the housekeeper. There met a right jovial crew. Many aching heads and sorrowful hearts have walked out of the doors. So, he's already doing a roaring trade in the pub, but Dicky then sees another business opportunity. He gets his auctioneer's licence and starts holding auctions out the back of the hotel. He would hold animal auctions as well as furniture, valuables, anything really. And that wasn't all. Dicky also dabbled in that age-old Aussie tradition, horse racing. Regardless of your thoughts on the ethical issues around horse racing, as a nation, Australia really does love the GGs. So, as well as publican, as well as auctioneer, Dicky is also positioning himself as some kind of Bart Cummings of Launceston. But just like races nowadays, back then the Launceston races weren't without the odd bit of controversy. Listen to this bizarre apology that appeared in the paper in 1828. I'm not sure of the story behind it, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory in quite a funny way. To Mr. Richard White, I regret having been induced by misrepresentation to offer personal violence to you during the last Launceston races. I am now perfectly convinced of the impropriety of my conduct, and I believe that I can in no way more clearly manifest my sorrow than by thus publicly apologising for so unwarrantable a proceeding. I therefore solicit that you will be pleased to direct the legal proceedings instituted against me to be stayed, and hope that the friendship which prior to the late unfortunate event so long subsisted between us may not be extinguished by a fault of which I heartily repent. Richard Heaney. So we seem to have Dicky front and centre of a town that's full of drinkers and gamblers. Remember, this is the same kind of era that we have convicts absconding, heading into the bush to become bushrangers, plus Launceston itself is really the last sizable place before you get to the untouched wilderness of the northwest of Van Diemen's Land. It's a tough, wild, frontier town, and to be honest, Dicky is kind of this shining light of jollity in the middle of it all. Just to give a bit of a description here of Launceston at that time and the area of Norfolk Plains where we have a lot of Norfolk Islanders settled, here are some notes from a man called Edward Kerr. Kerr worked for the Van Diemen's Land Company, and he was in charge of the first settlement at Circular Head, out on the northwest tip of Tassie. He wasn't very well liked, and he definitely had some pretty forthright opinions. He wrote a bunch of guides to Van Diemen's Land aimed at emigrants, and in one of them, this is what he says about the inhabitants of Norfolk Plains. Nothing can surpass the native beauties and excellence of soil in Norfolk Plains, but their possessors have done little beyond making them celebrated for their crimes, the lands themselves being left prey to every noxious weed that grows. He also talks of the inhabitants' moral turpitude before he also gets stuck into Launceston. Launceston, which is far inferior to Hobart Town, in its buildings, public and private, contains about 250 houses and 1,200 inhabitants. The houses, the generality of which may be more properly called hovels, are mostly built of wood, and there are but 2 or 3 which consist of more than a ground floor. Now, let's take all that with a pinch of salt. This bloke isn't content with just disparaging the people of Van Diemen's Land. A few pages later, he also has it in for the trees. Listen to this. Ornamental timber is much wanted in Van Diemen's Land, as nothing can be more unsightly than the generality of the trees, thinly clothed with leaves and the trunks and huge branches covered with long, shaggy strips of dead bark, giving the beholder an idea of desolation and decay. Anyway, let's leave Edward Kerr cursing his shaggy trees and get back to Dicky. He's finally living his best life. He can be himself. He spent years working as someone else's servant. Remember, his nickname out on the ship was Coates because of his penchant for looking the part as he worked in these impressive houses. But he's taken pride in that work, and he perhaps sees himself as something of a gentleman. So he talks to everyone, people of all classes, high and low. And this is the perfect way to be as a publican, really, so that side of his personality meshes well with his role of pub landlord. He plays the fiddle for them. Again, what's a pub without a bit of live entertainment, right? And he dresses the part. He's known for looking pretty dapper, which is described in a book called Convict Theatres. He worked hard to live the image of a gentleman. He raced horses, maintained one of the township's earliest carriages, built up substantial land holdings, and was remembered for his smart Wellington boots, his white buckskin breeches, cutaway coat and top hat, as well as for his enthusiasm as a fiddle player. In fact, there is a fairly bizarre and most likely untrue rumour that Dicky was actually the inspiration for the original Johnny Walker label. I did look into this. The image of the man on the Johnny Walker labels was actually created in 1908. He's called the Striding Man, and the caricature was created by a leading English illustrator, Tom Brown, who, as far as I can tell, never visited Australia and in fact was born about 20 years after Dicky died. It's likely the rumour only came about because of the striking similarity between Dicky and the drawing. So maybe we can chalk it up to that for now and move on. Anyway, Dicky's a bit of an eccentric and maybe a slightly comical character, but he's the guy who knows everyone and the guy who everyone likes. Think of him as the town's morale officer. There are a bunch of little throwaway lines in newspaper articles that combine to give a nice picture of a warm, centre-of-the-community type of guy. The dinner was provided by Mr. Richard White with his usual liberality. The hotels, particularly Mr. Richard White's, and many private houses were illuminated, and many upon a very liberal scale. There are those now living who can bear witness that he possessed marked traits of kindness and disinterested benevolence. Dicky and Sarah are now living together. This is stated clearly on her husband William's convict conduct record. And Henry is now like a son to Dicky. He becomes a publican as well. He has land next to Dicky. In fact, nowadays around the corner from Dick White's lane in the middle of Launceston is Clayton's lane as well. Henry marries Mary McLaughlin in 1820. They end up having 10 children. And in the same year, Dicky's son John marries Martha Basham. We've heard a lot about the Basham family in previous episodes. Together they have 6 children. So Dicky, Sarah, Henry and John all get on with living their lives. But Dicky and Sarah aren't as young as they used to be, and Dicky begins to dream of going back home, back to old Blighty. In 1836, 22-odd years after building it, he leases the Launceston Hotel and essentially retires. He's about 63 now, and we also don't know how his early life, his time on the Hillsborough amid the typhus epidemic and his time on Norfolk Island under the cruel Commander Foveaux, has affected his long-term health. This is when he and Henry Clayton start to come up with a plan to move back to London. They sell or lease furniture, land, other possessions, and in 1840 they buy their tickets to sail back to England. There are a few of them heading back. There's Dicky and Sarah, Henry and his wife with 5 out of their 6 kids that they had at that point, and John's 2 eldest daughters, though John stayed in Van Diemen's Land. When Dicky was last in the mother country, things were very different. He was a lowly servant. He was a criminal, freezing, starving, dirty, facing the noose at Newgate Prison. He was right at the bottom of the societal rung. Now here he was, a respectable gentleman, a wealthy business owner, and he was ready to take his rightful place back in the English gentry. But as ever, things didn't quite work out as Dicky intended. I feel like throughout Dicky's life, every time he's had interactions with the English, things have gone belly up for him. Things really go belly up now. On 20th of February 1841, we have this report in the Cornwall Chronicle. We regret exceedingly to have confirmed by the Indian that Mr. White had been placed in a private madhouse in London. A passenger by that vessel, Mr. Bramsgrove, accompanied by his brother, went to the establishment in Bethnal Green where they saw Mr. White. Mr. Bramsgrove, who had known Mr. White for many years and who was quite aware of his eccentricities, was unable to recognise in his manner or conversation any symptoms of madness. Every inhabitant of this town, indeed, we may say every old inhabitant of the colony, must recollect the singular deportment, the eccentric humour which characterised Dicky White. His madness, if madness it were, consisted in an assumed liberty of conversation to great and small, which his long residence in this place and his extremely charitable disposition seemed to sanction. No person here ever felt offended with Dick White, but it is quite probable that a similar behaviour among strangers might induce a belief that he was a little flighty. The article then ends with this paragraph. We think the best thing that could be done for Mr. White would be to send him out here again where he would be amongst his old friends and need not fear being put into a madhouse. It says a lot that the town is so eager for Dicky to be saved and does whatever it can to help him get back with his friends, even from that distance. Eventually, there's word that Dicky has been released from the insane asylum. In March 1841, there's this article. We have much pleasure in reporting that Mr. White has been released from the madhouse in which he was so improperly confined. The next arrival from London will, we trust, bring satisfactory accounts from Mr. White and of his intention to return to this colony, where he need not fear that his little peculiarities will be visited by so awful and distressing a consequence. It took a while to secure passage, but by November 1842, Dicky arrived back in Launceston, much to everyone's relief. Poor old Dicky. In Van Diemen's Land he was the centre of the community, loved by all, with his eccentricities understood by the entire population. He steps foot back in London and immediately they lock him up again. But listeners, I promised you a love story. I haven't forgotten. Let's have it now. Dicky and Sarah have been together now for decades. He must have been concerned that they weren't officially married, though, as he left particular provision for her in his will, knowing that otherwise she wouldn't get anything if he were to die. But then in 1845, William Clayton dies of cancer. Sarah is now a widow and free to marry again. Dicky proposes and she says yes. William died on the 9th of March. Just 6 weeks later, on the 19th of April, Dicky and Sarah finally marry. The marriage certificate lists their ages as 70 and 65, though Dicky is probably a bit older than that. They spend their remaining years as man and wife. Then 4 years later, in 1849, Dicky dies, aged around 77. Dicky was buried in Cypress Street Cemetery in Launceston, which unfortunately is now completely devoid of gravestones and is being used as a sports field for a school. But even though we have no grave, his legacy lives on. The Launceston Hotel lasted as a pub for well over 160 years, though it has since been turned into shops. Meanwhile, there are now hundreds of descendants of Dicky dotted around Australia who cherish this slightly odd but completely lovable character who, despite all the trials that life threw at him, continued to play the fiddle, pour a drink, and have a laugh. Well, folks, that's Dicky White. I told you he packed a lot into his life and it's taken a while to recount it all. Next time, though, we're going to have something completely different. We will hear a story about a man who, unlike Dicky, was unscrupulous, only looked out for number one, but also played an integral part in an event which shaped the history of the entire world. It's a story of con artists and spies, deception and war. Think Dirty Rotten Scoundrels meets Casablanca. You won't have ever heard of him, well, maybe you haven't, but we will be talking about Baron Rudolf von Koenig, a name which, like a lot of things about him, is not real. But despite his many failings, he was vital in helping the British crack the German Enigma code. In the meantime, make sure you visit the website ratbagsandroustabouts.com, where, as I said earlier, you can send me any ideas you have for stories that I could feature in future episodes. And while you're there, also look at the show notes for today's episode, where I've got that extra little nugget that didn't make it into the show. It's a funny story I came across when researching Norfolk Island. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you subscribe to the show and join me again for more stories about those common as muck ratbags and roustabouts from our past who still have extraordinary tales to tell.